Flutter CTO survey interviews, powered by LeanCode. Let's build great apps together.
Hi and welcome. We've got a great scenery here for our interview. Thank you for inviting us to your backyard, and especially as this is a very intensive time. We're meeting just before Google I/O that starts tomorrow, so thank you for the invitation here.
Yeah, thank you for taking your time out of your first visit to the States. As you mentioned, I/O is tomorrow, so it's been pretty busy on our end, but I'm always happy to talk about Flutter.
Great, thanks. Let's start very briefly, imagining the situation in which your best friend is starting a startup and considering technology for his project. Would you recommend Flutter for them?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Flutter is obviously a great choice for anyone who wants to ship their app to iOS, Android, possibly the web. You get desktop in there for free as well. And if someone is targeting multiple platforms, which most pieces of software are, then the comparison of maintaining multiple code bases is, well, I think Flutter just kind of wins in a landslide there. The ease of development, hot reload, the Dart static analysis, just the experience of writing a Flutter app, so pleasant. I would absolutely recommend Flutter.
Great. So it's clear that for startups, it's definitely a good choice, at least should be for the majority of the cases. And how about enterprises? How about, really big companies which have sometimes really complicated products? Is also Flutter enterprise ready?
Yeah, so Google has proven out that Flutter is enterprise ready by using Flutter for many of its own enormous apps. I think a recent kind of banner headline grabbing app, the YouTube Create app, obviously built by the YouTube team, is one of the most involved, complicated, not typical down the middle apps you could ever imagine. And Flutter is totally up to the challenge for that kind of an app. So there's a lot of other apps across Google as well. Google Classroom, GPay, Google Earth recently used Flutter to rebuild their app. And I think those just demonstrate very clearly by example that Flutter is ready for enormous apps. And then looking outward into the community, we've seen from the beginning, I think back to even BMW in the 2018-2019 range was using Flutter to build an enormous app to customize car purchases for end consumers. And Flutter has always been up to that challenge of very large, very robust, tons of features, high security requirements, high stability and testability requirements. And in the years since, that was early post the 1.0, some of those early, like BMW, their app. In the years since, Flutter has only grown more stable, more mature, more performant. It now targets more platforms where a company may want to ship their software, and I think it's totally ready for the enterprise scenario.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. We also witnessed this amazing growth of Flutter. And how about objections, right? So are you still convincing some other companies or even internally at Google, talking to the teams when they are considering technology for the new product or for the new version of the current product? What are the objections that you typically hear?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones comes from, honestly, native developers who know the native development experience. They know the native tool chain and all of the details that go into building an app with either Xcode or Java Kotlin in Android Studio on direct Android. And the thought of a new cross-platform framework is admittedly can be a tough sell for some of those developers, especially if they have prior experience with other cross-platform frameworks that maybe were frustrating to use in certain ways. And obviously the cross-platform story goes back almost 15 years now to when iOS and Android were kind of both really taking off. And in the early days, it was a pretty painful experience. So a lot of native developers maybe recall that. They may have personally sworn off cross-platform development. You know, they have their own hashtag never again around that. And so that's definitely a source of friction. And then the other one is often just around the sheer scope of the task of a rewrite for an enterprise app. I mean, if you've got 1 million plus lines of code, and a lot of apps get into that 2-3 million range, which is a lot of code, and then you've got all of your tooling, all of your testing, all of your integrations with third-party things, your CI to release the software, and you just have solved so many problems around your existing setup, which again, you probably have 2 setups. You know, you have your Android setup, you've solved all of these questions once, and then you solved them again for your Android development, CI, pipeline, and everything. And it's just a lot to think about resetting all of that knowledge, refacing all of those questions, building out answers to those problems, once again from scratch. And so a lot of developers, enterprise especially, will look at that and just kind of say immediately, it's an absolute non-starter.
Right. However, with the number of positive arguments in favor of Flutter, companies are considering migrating even very big apps with millions of code to Flutter. And very often the question is how. So what are, let's say, recommended ways of Flutter adoption? What would you say to the senior executive managers, business managers who are considering Flutter? What should be the way they should adopt?
Yeah, so there's certainly 2 paths to go from native apps to a Flutter app. And they are the incremental approach or the wholesale approach. And just kind of philosophically, of course, those would be the only 2 ways. So the wholesale approach is the simpler path, but it generally involves a maybe 1 to 2 year, depending on the size of the development team, the size of the app, freeze in new features. You say, we're not going to ship anything for however long this takes. You know, this is the state of our current app, and we're going to replicate that in Flutter and then move forward. And the Google Classroom team recently completed just such an effort, and actually just published a blog post kind of outlining their adventure and also the metrics of their feature development velocity increases that they've seen since shipping their rewrite with Flutter, and their kind of formula for when they know they will have paid back all of the investment of the rewrite. And so they've figured out, you know, it's going to take X amount of features, and in the several months, I think they've launched between 6 and 9 months ago for Android and iOS from memory. I'm not sure it's exactly that, but they've already paid down 40% of their investment to rewrite the app in just a few months, because they're now developing features literally 3 times as fast, because they only write it once, it takes less lines of code, and then there's just less coordination overhead between the things, right? That's the core Flutter story. So that's the direct approach, and it's of course not always appropriate. You know, for many apps, they've got a ton of features that their users are demanding, and a 2-year feature freeze is a complete non-starter. And so for those, then you look at the incremental add to app approach. And admittedly, that's an area where the Flutter team is looking to spend a lot of time and energy kind of smoothing out, reducing friction in that adventure or in that path in the near term. Because an initial theory that the Flutter team had, and this goes back a lot of years to the 2018, 2019 range, was that would be a very important user journey to support. But then what actually happened for the first Google customers was they tested Flutter, and obviously not every single one immediately jumped to Flutter, but the ones that did decided, actually, let's just do a complete rewrite. This incremental thing seems cool and whatnot, but we just want a clean slate. and we know our code base will be better if we have a clean slate as opposed to this kind of hodgepodge Frankenstein, technically Frankenstein's monster, incremental code base through the transition. Clean slate, let's do it from scratch. And so the add to app story just kind of got a little de-emphasized over the years because our biggest customers, right, Google teams that were using Flutter, kept not using it. But we hear repeatedly now from the community, from enterprises, that it's absolutely required. And so in the next 1 to 2 years, starting now, but for the next while, it's going to be receiving a lot of attention, a lot of love to hopefully become a lot smoother.
Excellent. And this is the reason why it was also mentioned on the roadmap.
Exactly.
For the Flutter this year, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Good. And if we can take a step backwards, so indeed there are many advantages of Flutter that eventually convince the teams, and then the question of choice how. But before the question of how appears, there's still the question of if. And sometimes we hear from the companies who are just before that decision that they are somehow afraid that Google will abandon Flutter. So it's this risk is still echoing among decision makers. How would you address that specifically?
Yeah, will Google kill Flutter is a timeless question. I don't think that question will ever go away, but a little bit of inside baseball for what Flutter means to Google. And for non-baseball fans, that's an old show where people just talked about the most nitty-gritty baseball details possible. And so the kind of how the sausage is made, so to speak, what Flutter means to Google. Every time a Google team uses Flutter, they deliver a certain amount of software with a certain amount of headcount. And with Flutter, that headcount always goes down. So people are allowed to work on more projects or switch teams, or there's just greater flexibility for what Google builds every time any team chooses Flutter, because maybe you needed 10 developers for iOS, 10 for Android, 10 for the web, and with Flutter at just 15 you're totally comfortable, or you still use all 30 and you ship it really fast. So however you slice it, less effort goes into building software with Flutter, and that's called negative headcount. So let's say an app takes 2 years, you keep those 30 people, but it was estimated it was going to take 4 years if it wasn't Flutter. So that's 2 years of negative 30 people in terms of money that Flutter saved Google. Right. And that's an enormous amount of savings. And at the Flutter team, we love to keep track of that kind of stuff. And so it's by a solid margin true that Flutter saves Google more headcount than are even on the teams of Dart and Flutter. And the teams of Dart and Flutter are not small. So right out of the gate, Flutter doesn't cost Google money to build because of Google's own internal usage of Flutter. And then beyond that, and there's a lot of varying theories for how and why this is true, but we know that developers who use Flutter tend to route more money to Google than developers who don't. And some of those reasons are obvious, like in the States especially, a lot of developers will ship to iOS first, and hopefully they get around to Android. And if a developer uses Flutter, they're much more likely to ship a high quality Android app. Flutter apps also have more engagement because they just tend to be extremely high quality, and we theorize that that just means that users do more, they have more in-app purchases, they fulfill the user journeys more often in Flutter apps. And then a third possible theory is that Flutter developers just tend to use more other Google products like Firebase and Google Cloud and other things that put money into Google's pocket. And so when Google is a business and is trying to make money and is worried about what is an expensive cost center, what's an expensive drain, Flutter is not one of those. So the combination of Flutter generating money for Google, despite being 100% free. Flutter will never charge a penny to anyone ever. And despite that, does not cost Google money, and is used so prolifically internally, all of those apps would need to be rewritten. The abandonment of the Flutter SDK would, even if the community picked it up, I think it would be a tough sell to continue using internally for those teams. They would, I think, justifiably have a lot of concern about the future of that project, even if Flutter was totally healthy by community maintenance. And so those projects would probably need to be rewritten, so that would be even more cost. Not only would you stop getting that negative headcount, but you'd have to rewrite all the apps that have been written in Flutter. And so the possible decision to kill Flutter, of course, no one can predict the future, and Google has surprised us all in the past, but it just doesn't seem to be in the cards.
Right, so due to those like 3 tiers of benefits, right, it's perfectly justifiable that Flutter with Google will continue, and Google will support Flutter forever. And because it's of such a great importance, as you've mentioned, for Google, you're definitely also closely monitoring other competitive frameworks, right? Mm-hmm. So, because we've talked a lot, you give a lot of examples of how Flutter could be better in terms of this negative headcounts and other advantages in comparison to native technologies. And how about other cross-platform frameworks? Because when Flutter appeared on the stage, 2018, 19, in those early days, it was a revolution, right? We've also experimented with other cross-platform solutions, and we had absolutely no doubt that the Flutter is the way to go for us, and we've totally migrated for Flutter, recommending it as a #1 cross-platform technology. However, those advantages from early days of Flutter, like hot reload, like adoption of Skia and all of that, have also been recently embraced and adopted by other cross-platform frameworks, right? So what's right now the major competitive advantage if you look at the landscape of other cross-platforms solutions that have definitely also evolved following Flutter way?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no end to one's need to innovate. As you said, Flutter established a bar, and a lot of other projects took inspiration from the initial Flutter release and implemented some of those good ideas, and have since implemented their own good ideas. And Flutter absolutely looks at those projects. We see what developers are talking about on Twitter, syntax that is in another framework, or in terms of composing a UI, or even lower level, just language primitives. Kotlin developers have a lot of great features that they miss if they use anything other than Kotlin. And so Dart has been evolving as well, and kind of adding some of those most requested features. And Dart is always striving to improve and will never be static. So on the one hand, Flutter and Dart are aggressively looking for inspiration from, we don't even really think of them as competitors, but just Flutter alternatives. And but to the second part of your question, what would the competitive advantage of specifically Flutter be right now? I think Flutter still, and credit to Dart for this, still has state-of-the-art developer experience. I'm not aware of anyone else that has implemented stateful hot reload with the grace that Flutter and Dart have. And just the keystroke speed analysis is so strong and so great. And we see the Flutter team has observed repeatedly a 3x productivity boost, and we mentioned this earlier, when a development team switches from native to cross-platform, specifically Flutter. And I don't know what the productivity boost is switching from native to a different cross-platform solution, but I would be surprised if the numbers bore out a equivalent 3x increase.
Right. indeed, that's also what we've observed, together with those low maintenance costs afterwards, right? So that's definitely also a great advantage here. And speaking about this constant loop of innovation and trying to think about new things, what are the challenges for Flutter in the future? Like, what are, you've mentioned on one hand that this developer's journey through adding the Flutter to existing app, this is something where you're looking for improvements. And what are other fields where you think, where you hope the Flutter will develop?
Yeah, enticing enterprise developers is absolutely high on the list, but I think unrealized potential on the web has got to be the greenest area right now for growth. And wasm is, I think, really going to have a big impact there. I saw some benchmarks the other day for a web app running on wasm, and frame times were in the 2 to 3 millisecond range. So that's 300 to 500 frames a second, which of course only the most ridiculous monitors can even achieve. But the performance of wasm, of Flutter compiling all of your application code, all of the framework code, not just to JavaScript, which has been done forever, but to WebAssembly, is so strong, and I think opens up such a tremendous opportunity for Flutter to be the runaway default web runtime that, you know, our team is working very hard on it. We work closely with the actual wasm council. I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but you know, work closely with them and browsers and other companies to all make sure wasm supports everyone's use case, highlighted by the recent edition of wasm GC garbage collection, which, you know, Dart as a garbage collected language needed before a Dart app could ever be compiled to wasm. But this is all coming together now, and the results are so promising and so exciting. I mean, 2 milliseconds for a frame. If it's the counter app just sitting there, that's not so impressive. But you know, if it's if some stuff's going on, things are animating, that is very, very cool. And I think the web is, because the web is the greatest software distribution mechanism in the history of computers. And so Flutter's success on the web is the greatest potential kind of on the horizon, I think, right now.
Okay, great. So, and like we are today, just a day before Google I/O, and
Yep.
I think from the agenda that, and from Kevin Moore's appearance in the keynote, that this will receive the proper spotlight, right?
Yes, the keen eye, astute observation. Yes, Kevin Moore's appearance does indicate that there will be some WASM updates. And for our viewing audience, those updates have already been announced. So yeah, we're making strides, making progress. It's really exciting.
Perfect, and that also builds the bridge to our next interview that we're going to have with Kevin. So we're going to also ask about the development of Flutter for Web in our next recording. But still for our current conversation, like you've mentioned all those benefits of Flutter, you've mentioned all those advantages of Flutter, and I wanted to ask you about like real life cases. What are the apps that impressed you the most recently, over, I don't know, the period of last 3 to 6 months that you've seen in a Flutter? And because you've mentioned earlier as well that this is a really important part of the value the Flutter delivers, that you can actually build robust, beautiful, performative apps with Flutter for all possible platforms, right? And we are always constantly looking for new examples that are also inspiring for us, sharing those examples, trying new apps here and there. So I'm just wondering, what are the examples that made impression on you recently?
That's a great question. And the two that come to mind, I've both already referenced in this, but I would just call attention back to YouTube Create, which is a really impressive piece of software. And also the new WebAssembly numbers. Last year, my I/O effort was a code lab about building a next-gen UI in Flutter, and that used some pretty cool shaders to have this really, unique experience. And even a year ago, but with in Chrome, different experiment flags turned on, that did run in WebAssembly, but it should be just base Flutter now to run an app like that in WebAssembly. And they're so performant, they run so fast that I think if I think for longer, maybe I'll come up with some more, but those two immediately come to mind.
Okay, great. So we recommend to everyone to look them up if you didn't yet. Okay, Craig, thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for giving this interview in this beautiful surrounding and with the atlas accompanying us, our hero lying here down. Great, so it was my pleasure to talk to you, and we'll see each other at Google I/O tomorrow.
Sounds great. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
Build your next project with us. Schedule a free 30 minutes consultation.